Hey guys, tonight we drift west slowly, lazily over a warm and wrinkled ocean that smells like damp rope, crushed salt, and something very faintly fishy that no one wants to investigate too closely. We begin not with an empire or a king, but with a canoe, a long, stitched, creaking thing made of trees that once grew in the singing hills of an island so far from anything else that even the birds got lost trying to find it. The sun has gone down, finally, and the stars are beginning to chatter overhead like nosy uncles. The waves slap the hull like tired applause. Somewhere in the distance, a goat sneezes. Tonight, we're talking about the kinds of people who looked at this impossibly large ocean and thought, yes, let's cross it. With no compass, no map, and occasionally no idea whose cousin packed the wrong kind of tarot. We're talking about ancient Polynesian navigators, seafarers who roamed an area larger than all of Europe, using sea foam, stars, bird gossip, and possibly very strong tea. And they did it so consistently well that Western explorers, centuries later, accused them of accidental discovery, presumably because no one could believe someone without a powdered wig and a sextant could possibly out-navigate them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It keeps the lantern burning, the stew bubbling, and the bard from attempting another dramatic reenactment of the invention of the coconut spoon. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where and when you're listening from. It's oddly comforting to imagine all of you out there cozy in your beds, lights dimmed, fans humming, pets loafing nearby, sharing this rambling little voyage. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with an image, a canoe, not unlike a tired cricket resting on the swell of a great blue lung. The air is damp, the wind has dropped, the sea is smooth as old silk, and the sky is full of stars blinking like gossiping widows. Beneath that sky sits a navigator, not a captain, not a chief, but a quietly exhausted soul with sun-wrecked hair, squinting at the horizon as if trying to decide whether it's judging him. The Polynesians, you see, were masters of slow precision. Their canoes weren't just boats, they were survival stitched into hulls, double-hulled, often over 60 feet long, and lashed together with coconut fiber that somehow outlasted half the marriages in the village. The main trick, of course, was knowing where you were without pretending you did. The stars helped, the wind helped, and yes, so did sea foam, but we'll get to that. First, let's talk about the canoe. These vessels were hand-built with tools made of shell, stone, or the occasional repurposed bone that may or may not have belonged to someone who lost a dice game. The wood was sacred. The keel was blessed. The nails were not nails at all, but cords twisted from hibiscus bark until they could outstare a storm. No metal, no screws. Just faith and friction and a good deal of coconut-based ingenuity. And despite every logical reason they shouldn't float, they did. In fact, they glided smooth and swift over swells that could swallow smaller vessels whole. The balance came not just from physics, but from generations of careful listening. Yes, listening. Polynesian navigators listened to their boats the way a tavern cook listens to her stew, with one ear open for the subtle groan that says, almost done, and another for the more alarming hiss that says, someone dropped a boot in again. But why build such large, carefully balanced canoes if you weren't planning to go terribly far? That's the point. These people weren't paddling out for a bit of seaweed and back before supper. They were aiming for islands invisible beyond the horizon, guided by nothing more than memory, experience, and the collective grudge of every ancestor who'd ever pointed sternly at the sea and said, "That way," and the ancestors, yes, they were involved. Polynesian navigation wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. Each journey carried the names of those who'd sailed before, whispered like a chant over the bow. You didn't just sail, you communed. The canoe was alive. The ocean was a body. The stars were eyes. And if you messed up, someone's great-great-grandmother was going to show up in your dream and scold you for 3 nights straight. Historians still argue, of course, about just how far the early Polynesians went, and when some say they settled Hawaii around 500 years ago, others insist they reached South America before Columbus even learned to hold a globe right side up. And then there's the chicken, yes, a chicken whose bones were found in Chile, and whose DNA suggests a Polynesian voyage that shouldn't have been possible unless someone very determined paddled across thousands of miles of open ocean with a squawking, feathered travel companion. That chicken, if you're wondering, gets a statue in my inn, right next to the shelf of inaccurate maps and the jar of mysterious beans no one wants to identify. But back to our canoe. Picture it again. The wind has changed. The navigator shifts his weight slightly to the left. Not much, just enough to catch the swell in a different rhythm. He watches a small curl of foam peel off the stern, like a thought trying to leave quietly. He smells something rain, maybe, or salt-dried fish, or the sharpness of an island breeze that's still a day away. This is where the real work begins, because now the stars are rising, and they are not just stars. Not to him. They are signs, positions, anchors for memory. He leans back, closes his eyes for just a moment, and lets the boat tell him where to go. The canoe that shouldn't float, but did, is still gliding calm and patient across the ocean's old back, while its builders, long forgotten by most history books, continue to hum through the wood grain. It's a quiet craft, unassuming, not the sort of thing that demands admiration. In fact, if you stumbled upon one washed ashore, you might mistake it for an oversized fruit basket with ambition. But this particular fruit basket once crossed thousands of miles of ocean with no compass, no anchor, and exactly one chicken too many. Now, let us take a moment to appreciate the madness of early Polynesian canoe making. These weren't ships in the European sense, with carved figureheads and groaning timber, no cannons, no galley kitchens, no lower decks full of sweaty mutineers with poor hygiene and worse poetry. Just long, elegantly curved hulls, often doubled for balance, crafted from breadfruit trees and stitched with plant fiber strong enough to give your dentist a heart attack. The double hull design is especially clever. It provides stability, speed, and enough space for your extended family, several baskets of yams, a few semi-cooperative pigs, and that one elderly uncle who refuses to wear anything but a leaf. When one hull dips, the other balances. When both agree to float, the canoe hums forward, like a dream being slowly paddled into existence. The people who built these marvels didn't follow blueprints. They followed memory. Grandfather told father, father told son, and son occasionally pretended to listen while carving rude shapes into a paddle. Measurements were taken by finger lengths, foot spans, and the very ancient, very inconsistent unit of whatever fits. Yet somehow, every part served a purpose. The ribs gave strength. The outriggers gave grace. The lashings, those tangled miracles, held it all together like a determined grandmother, refusing to admit the stew has burned. Historians still argue whether these canoes were truly seaworthy in the modern sense. Some claim they'd fall apart in rough conditions. Others point to modern recreations that have successfully voyaged across the Pacific, guided by nothing but traditional techniques and sheer stubbornness. One thing is certain, for something built without nails or glue. They held up far better than the explorer ships that later followed, most of which promptly fell apart near Tahiti, while someone wrote a long-winded journal about how the locals seemed suspiciously competent. But what really makes these canoes special is what they carried. Not just people, not just food, but culture, stories, genealogies longer than most royal lineages, sung into the air as lullabies and steering charts. These boats weren't just transport, they were time machines, carrying the past across waves to greet the future. Imagine the launch. The whole village gathers, hushed but buzzing. The canoe sits at the shore like a great beast, waiting to be woken. Someone begins to chant soft at first, then louder. Children throw flowers. The chief spits coconut water for luck, an act both ceremonial and refreshing. Then, with a final push, the canoe slips into the surf, rocking like a nervous guest at a feast. And off they go, into a horizon most of us would find indistinguishable from the sky. No landmarks, no lighthouses, just the navigator at the bow, squinting into wind and wave, pretending not to notice that someone already dropped the dried breadfruit overboard. It's worth noting that not all voyages went well. Sometimes the ocean changed its mind halfway through. Sometimes a hull cracked or a storm rose or a goat panicked and chewed through the lashings. Yet even then, survival often came not from luck, but from the design. These canoes could flex, could bend, could be repaired mid-ocean with bits of spare vine and whatever cleverness the crew still had left after 3 days. Without sleep, there's a story, a half-forgotten one. Mind you of a canoe that split apart somewhere west of what we now call Tonga. The crew, unfazed, lashed the pieces together in a new configuration, basically building a floating raft with a mild identity crisis. They sailed it another 800 miles before reaching an island that hadn't seen visitors in 3 generations. When they arrived, the locals threw a feast so large the canoe itself was used as a serving platter. No one could decide if that was an insult or an honor. But the stew was good, and the pigs only bit a little. And let's not forget the importance of canoe naming. These weren't generic vessels labeled Voyager 7 or Canoe Beta. Oh no. Each had a name steeped in meaning. Wave Dancer, Star Listener, or the one that smells of fish, even when it's clean. Names carried mana or spiritual energy, and a poorly chosen name could curse a voyage faster than a dropped coconut on the shaman's toe. Even the construction was sacred. Canoes were often blessed before the first tree was felled. Offerings were made, songs sung, ancestors consulted. And somewhere, always, someone was sent to fetch more cordage and returned 3 days later with a sunburn, a sheepish grin, and exactly the wrong kind of wood. The building process could take months, even years, but once complete, a canoe wasn't just a tool, it was kin. Part of the community, sometimes quite literally, as in-laws were added to the crew out of politeness, practicality, or sheer inability to say no to a cousin with a large spear and poor impulse control. And so the canoe floated, quietly incredible, made of trees and rope and prayer, built to endure the Pacific's rolling tantrums, its sudden calms, its infinite jokes about where the horizon went. It became an extension of the navigator's will, the ancestors' memory, and the community's need to know what lay just beyond the edge of the known. It shouldn't have worked, but it did, over and over again. And as we'll soon see, it wasn't just the canoe that made it possible, but the strange, whispered language of the ocean itself. Somewhere out there, past the squinting edge of a cloud-choked horizon, a soft puff of white blooms, like the sigh of a lazy spirit. Not lightning, not fog, just a cloud, sitting oddly with a base too flat, a belly too dark, and an attitude too suspicious. The navigator notices, of course he does. He's been watching the sky all morning. And this cloud, that odd little fluff, doesn't belong here. Polynesian navigators, you see, didn't just read the stars and waves. They read clouds. Or, more precisely, they listened to what clouds were trying not to say. Now, before we get too lofty, let's acknowledge something. Modern meteorology, with all its satellites, radar, and suspiciously confident weather people, has trained us to think clouds are mere harbingers of rain, or perhaps dramatic backdrops for breakups. But to ancient navigators, clouds were clues, bold, floaty clues, drifting across an endless blue page. To understand why, let's recall a very basic fact. Islands change the sky, not dramatically, not like a volcanic tantrum, but subtly. Land, especially lush, leafy land, sweats. It exhales moisture. That breath rises, cools, and condenses into a specific type of cloud, low, puffy, sitting like a lazy dog just above the horizon. And if you know what to look for, you can spot that cloud from 50 miles away. So while the rest of the crew was arguing over whether the coconut stew was supposed to be that green, the navigator was squinting at a strange clump of clouds to the west, murmuring something about convection, thermals, and how that one looks like Uncle Laney's eyebrow when he's lying. Historians still argue whether this was truly a reliable method. After all, not every cloud means land, and not every navigator had perfect eyesight. There were mistakes. There's the famous story of the canoe that chased a promising cumulus for 3 days before realizing it was a sea mirage and not as previously claimed. Definitely the east side of Fiji, but most of the time, the clouds knew what they were doing. Cloud reading wasn't isolated guesswork either. It was part of a symphony of clues. Cloud shape, cloud movement, and even cloud color could all indicate the presence of land. A flat-bottomed cumulus might mean an island directly beneath. A dark belly suggested lush, wet terrain, clouds that stayed stubbornly fixed in the sky, while others drifted, were often perched atop something solid land that refused to be moved. And then there were reflections. Yes, reflections in the underside of clouds, faint tints of green or gold. These weren't hallucinations usually, but rather scattered light bouncing up from lagoons or coral reefs just beneath. It's a bit like seeing the reflection of a city skyline in the clouds above it, except the skyline is a coconut grove, and the observer hasn't slept in 2 days. Of course, none of this happened in isolation. Navigators would often combine cloud signals with wave feel, bird movement, and occasionally just a hunch. Not all clouds were helpful, and more than a few tried to lead people astray. But as the saying goes, and it does, if you're sleepy enough, a cloud with no land beneath it is just showing off. There's a legend, because of course there is, of a navigator named Taulelei, whose cloud reading skills were so precise that he once located an island based solely on the way a single lenticular cloud seemed to frown at him. He claimed the sky was pouting in that direction, and sure enough, they found land the next day. The crew praised him, the islanders fed him, and the bard wrote a mildly excessive poem comparing his eyes to double moons on a tide-warmed pond. The poem survives, barely. Now, not every navigator had the gift. Cloud reading required training, patience, and a complete absence of fear about being wrong in front of several tired fishermen and one skeptical pig. Apprentices were taught young, often starting by identifying cloud types over known land before being unleashed onto open ocean. The punishment for misreading a cloud, mostly teasing, and a few extra hours of bailing water, while the elders told the same storm story for the 50th time. Even today, Pacific Islanders in certain regions can still point to the sky and tell you what's brewing, whether it's just a squall passing through or a sign that land, food, and proper rest might be waiting not too far ahead. It's a knowledge passed quietly, like stew recipes or that one trick with the palm frond no one talks about. And let's not pretend the clouds didn't have personalities. Some days they clustered like gossiping aunties, blocking the stars and murmuring nonsense all night. Other days they fled before the canoe, like children caught stealing guava. And on rare, blessed mornings, they cleared just enough to let the navigator mark his bearings before slinking back across the sun like embarrassed ghosts. But the truly important clouds, the land clouds, they lingered. They held their shape, they waited, and the good navigators could find them even after days of rain, nights without stars, and one unfortunate incident with a fermented yam that had been accidentally weaponized. If you were lucky, you'd spot the island itself not long after, a faint green thread, a jagged line just above the ocean, usually accompanied by seabirds, circling like they'd placed bets on whether the canoe would make it. But before that came the clouds, the ever-drifting, ever-mysterious clouds, and in their quiet, watery language, they said, "Someone is waiting." Now then, if clouds were the gossiping aunties of the sky, always hinting, never quite saying, then the stars were the solemn elders, stern, unblinking, and fond of repetition. Polynesian navigators knew the stars like, the creak in your favorite chair, or the exact tone your neighbor uses when they're about to borrow your ladder for 6 months. These stars weren't just ornaments. They were coordinates, memories, maps etched into the night. Imagine you're lying in a canoe, the size of a city bus but twice as cooperative, on a clear night in the middle of the ocean. No lights, no engine hum, just the soft hushing of waves and the occasional snore from the goat. You look up and there it is, the sky as it was meant to be seen. Alive, vast, layered with stories, and moving, though you'd never catch it in the act. Polynesian navigators used what's often called a star compass, a mental chart divided into 32 named directions, each associated with the rising and setting of specific stars. This wasn't drawn on parchment or scratched into bark. It was memorized, practiced, and sung until it settled behind the eyes like a second horizon. Each star had a role. It rose in a predictable spot on the eastern horizon, arched overhead, and dropped in an equally predictable spot in the west. Some rose at 90 degrees, others at 140, and navigators could name the angle not with numbers, but with chants passed down through generations. These weren't vague recitations either. We're talking about hundreds of stars, their names, their paths, and even what time of year they behaved themselves. The clever bit. These stars weren't used all at once. No one's memory is that good, not even Uncle Mako's, and he once recited the entire genealogy of his canoe during a fever dream. Navigators used about 7-10 stars at a time, each to guide them along a particular leg of a voyage. When one star dipped below the horizon, another would rise in its place. The process continued, link by link, like passing the paddle during a long race. Historians still argue. Of course, some claim it's impossible to memorize that many celestial paths without charts. Others point to present-day wayfinders, particularly from the Micronesian island of Satawal, who've been trained since childhood to lie on their backs and map the heavens with their fingertips, using no tools but time and tradition. No telescopes, no sextants, just bone-deep repetition. One fringe detail you might enjoy. Some navigators claim to feel the direction of the stars, even when they couldn't see them navigating, by knowing where the star would be. Like a sort of celestial muscle memory, they'd tilt their head just slightly and say, "She's to the left," as if the star were a cousin arriving late to dinner. And let us not overlook the chants. These weren't decorative. Each line marked a star, a direction, a motion. They sounded something like, "When Tawaka rises, steer with the morning wind. When Lua falls, follow the foam." Soft, rhythmic, mnemonic, recited in storms, sung during long silences, and muttered during disagreements over whether the stew needed more sea salt or just fewer feet in it. In fact, there's one particularly famous chant known as the backbone of the sky. It's said to contain over 100 navigational cues and to be so sacred that only senior navigators are allowed to recite the final stanza. Naturally, the bard has tried twice. He was pelted with dried banana skins and given stew duty for a week. And yes, sometimes the stars did move, at least from the perspective of a canoe bobbing on the planet's surface. That's where seasonal variation came in. A navigator had to know when a star would rise earlier, set later, or vanish entirely for a month. It was like trying to navigate a dinner party where your guests kept switching chairs and insisting they'd always sat there, but the Polynesians took it in stride. They watched, they listened, they adjusted. In fact, star charts were sometimes encoded into string patterns or woven mats, not as literal maps but as reminders. A knot here meant look for Altair, a twist there meant turn when you see Sirius kiss the sea. Let's not forget the most charming detail of all. Some navigators gave their stars personalities, not in the lofty, mythological sense, no. More like neighbors. Some were stubborn, some were late risers, some were chatty and hard to miss. One particularly bright star, Capella, was apparently known on a few islands as the star that will not stop glaring. There's a goat involved in that story, but it's too early in the night for that kind of mischief. And on nights when the stars vanished, when clouds sulked, or the wind screamed too loud to think, navigators did not panic. They remembered, they retraced, they steered by wave, by wind, by the memory of light. The sky would return. It always did, and when it did, it carried more than stars. It carried confirmation that you were not lost, that the ancestors were still watching, that the canoe still knew the way, as long as you listened. So when next you look up at the stars, especially if you're lying awake at 3 wondering why your ceiling fan sounds like it's plotting something, just remember, once upon a time, someone used that same patch of sky to cross 1,000 miles of open ocean, guided only by starlight and a quiet promise. Home is out there, if you know how to read the sky. Sea foam, not the most dignified of navigational tools. If we're being honest, it doesn't sparkle like a star or stand firm like an island. It has no grand myths, no odes written in its honor. You won't find bards whispering sonnets about the noble foam. But oh, it was useful, underrated, always there, bubbling away at the edges of the story like a distracted kitchen apprentice who somehow keeps the fire from going out. Polynesian navigators didn't just watch the waves, they felt them. And when the water boiled into foam, when it hissed and curled and danced sideways across the hull, it told stories. Stories about where the current was headed. Stories about whether the wind was behaving. Stories about whether someone upstream had dropped a particularly clumsy paddle and cursed their lineage for 7 generations. Let's slow the canoe down for a moment. Picture it. Mid-afternoon. Sun overhead. The air so hot it tastes like boiled salt. The canoe glides forward. Not fast. Not slow. Just deliberately, the navigator crouches low at the edge, watching a line of foam split apart near the bow. He dips his fingers in, lifts them to his nose, sniffs. Not because the foam smells particularly enlightening, it usually smells like wet optimism, but because it helps him focus. See, different sea conditions leave different foamy footprints. Where 2 currents meet, the water churns in a specific way. Where an island blocks the flow, the sea peels back and froths differently. And where reefs lie just below, even out of sight, the water fizzes like a lazy kettle and changes tone. Foam becomes language fleeting, sibilant, slightly soggy language, but language nonetheless. One forgotten trick involved watching how long foam lasted. If it vanished quickly, The currents were pulling hard. If it lingered, swirling in lazy loops, then the water beneath was calm or confused, which in ocean terms is practically the same thing. Another subtle cue. The angle of foam trails behind the canoe. If the wake curled to the left when the wind blew from the east, it meant you were caught in a drift and needed to adjust before you ended up at the wrong island, or worse, at Aunt Mapu's surprise wedding feast with no gift and too many questions. Historians still argue about how accurate foam tracking really was. Some claim it's folklore charming, but unscientific. Others, especially those who've sailed using traditional methods, swear by it. One modern navigator even said, "You don't understand a wave until it slapped you with its own froth and told you to pay attention." Wise words, damp words, but wise? Now, for the fringe detail. Some navigators believed the foam had moods, not just texture or temperature, actual moods. A sharp, snapping foam was angry. A thin, sliding foam was nervous. A high, bubbling foam was laughing. Whether this was metaphor, intuition, or the result of drinking fermented breadfruit too early in the voyage is unclear, but many wayfinders treated foam as a living, reactive guide, one that didn't always like being ignored. This brings us, inevitably, to the incident with the sea cucumber, a tale told, perhaps too often. At the inn, it seems a novice navigator, eager to impress, misread a patch of foam and insisted the island lay to the northeast. The elder quietly disagreed, but the young man was persuasive and loud and had just finished a very dramatic song about conquering the horizon. So off they went, straight into a current that led them not to paradise, but to a breeding ground of sea cucumbers who expressed their displeasure in, shall we say, enthusiastic squirts. They turned back, slowly, covered in indignity and marine mucus, and the elder, without a word, began a new chant about listening before. Foam offends. It remains a popular lullaby for aspiring navigators to this day. Sea foam also interacted with other clues. For instance, if you paired foam behavior with wind direction and the flight of birds, you could triangulate a pretty solid guess at land position. It's not math, exactly. It's more like culinary intuition, how you know the stew is ready because it smells just slightly of apology. Speaking of wind, foam often hinted at its hidden layers. Surface breezes push the top of the water, but underneath, currents can rebel. Foam exposes that rebellion. A good navigator reads, both watching how the sea tears at itself, like a goat caught in a hammock. The direction of the foam's slip told you not just where you were going, but whether the ocean agreed with your plan. There's something humbling about this, isn't there? That people once crossed thousands of miles of open sea by reading foam, the ephemeral leftovers of a wave's tantrum, the ghost scribbles of a passing current. And yet it worked, often better than metal compasses in iron-heavy ships. Foam doesn't lie. It's too fleeting to bother. One last image for tonight. The navigator, long after sunset, resting with his hand still trailing in the sea, not paddling, just feeling. The foam flicks past his knuckles. A smile tugs at the corner of his mouth. He knows now. Knows something changed. A shift in flow. A sign of a reef nearby. Maybe even a whisper of land. He doesn't speak it. Doesn't need to. The canoe knows. The foam knows. And somewhere, probably behind a crate of squirming yams, the bard is quietly taking notes. There's a certain kind of bird that doesn't mind you watching it. It will stare back, cool as a cucumber, as if to say, yes, I am an omen. I won't explain myself. Polynesian navigators knew these birds well, not just as creatures of the sky, but as winged signposts, flapping punctuation marks in the sentence of the sea. You see, not all birds are helpful. Some just loiter, Others circle aimlessly like they've lost their grocery list. But a select few the wise. The consistent, the suspiciously businesslike became the navigator's companions. Among them, the frigate bird, the naughty tern, the sooty shearwater, and the occasional uninvited chicken who simply refused to disembark. Birds were, in fact, some of the earliest navigation assistants before the canoe even launched. Elders watched the sky for them. Birds leaving in the morning, flying low and straight, likely had a destination, usually land. Birds returning at dusk often traced the path back from fishing grounds. This wasn't random wing flapping. This was a daily commute. And if you followed it, you'd often arrive somewhere worth anchoring. Now, imagine yourself in the middle of the Pacific, no land in sight, the sea sighing below, the sun trying its best to boil your eyebrows off. Then, a shadow, a flick, a bird, just over the mast, flying not with the wind, but across it like it had somewhere to be. The navigator squints, tilts his head, and says, "Naughty, she's headed west." He doesn't shout, doesn't argue, just shifts the rudder half a handspan. The canoe turns. A new course begins. Historians still argue whether these bird tracking techniques were enough to ensure discovery of new islands. Could birds truly lead a canoe over hundreds of miles? Probably not alone, but as part of a layered system. Stars, clouds, waves, intuition, they filled in the blanks. Think of them as helpful but unreliable messengers, like a bard with a deadline. One forgotten detail that still charms the skeptical: the use of release birds. En long voyage, navigators brought tame birds in wicker cages, not pets, really more like feathery compasses. When uncertainty grew thick enough to stir the stew, they'd release a bird and watch. If it spiraled upward, aimless and moody, there was no land nearby. But if it flew in a straight line, especially low over the water, that was a sign, not a guarantee, but a suggestion. The bird would head for home, and if you were lucky, it was a home you hadn't discovered yet. Of course, this required the bird to want to go home. There are stories too many, honestly, of rebellious birds who flapped twice, landed on the mast, and went straight to sleep. Useless, smug. One even took a fish from the rations and gave the navigator a look that said, "You figure it out." That bird, legend has it, was later turned into a ceremonial hat or a stew. Depends who you ask. Still, most birds did their part, especially the frigate bird, a sleek creature with a wingspan wide enough to shade your entire lunch. Frigate birds can't land on water. They drown, which is unfortunate for them, but incredibly useful for you. Because if you see a frigate bird, you know it's either very close to land or regretting its choices. Another helpful character, the sooty shearwater. These birds migrate thousands of miles and can be seen in tight flocks, moving fast and low. Navigators often noted their path, saying it aligned with certain current flows. And if the birds were circling, it might mean a school of fish, and fish usually mean reef. And reef often means land, or sharp things, or at least something to hit if you aren't paying attention. But perhaps the most poetic practice was simply watching the flock. Not a single bird, but a pattern of them, their direction, height, frequency. A sudden increase in sightings could signal land ahead, or food, or an oncoming storm. Sometimes, a change in bird behavior lower flights. Erratic motion preceded shifts in weather, not a forecast. Exactly, but a mood swing, the sky's way of saying things are about to get dramatic. There's a tale told among the outer atolls of an apprentice navigator who refused to believe the birds. "They lie," he said. "They just fly for fun." So he steered by stars alone, ignoring the steady westward flight of 3 naughties overhead. The result? A reef, a loud crunch, a canoe wedged like a toothpick in a clam. The crew survived, mostly bruised in body and ego, and the navigator was gifted a hand-carved bird effigy to hang around his neck, a reminder to listen to the sky folk. Now, the skeptical among you may wonder, what if the birds got lost? What if they changed migration patterns? Indeed, they did. They still do. But the beauty of the Polynesian system is that it didn't rely on any one clue. Navigation was a mosaic, not a map. If one piece failed, another compensated. If the birds vanished, the waves still spoke. If the foam lied, the stars remembered. And besides, the birds often wanted to be followed. At least, that's what the elders said. They believed some birds were messengers from the gods sent to test your patience or reveal hidden land. Whether or not the birds agreed is a mystery best left unsolved. Some say the birds knew where the islands were long before the humans did. And maybe, just maybe, they enjoyed being asked. Picture, then, our navigator silent, calm, with the salt crusting on his skin, and the horizon flickering like a secret. A single bird slices across the sky. Not fast, not slow, just sure. And the navigator smiles, turns the rudder, and whispers, "Follow him." He doesn't need to explain. The sea already understands. The ocean, in all her sprawling moods, rarely repeats herself. Every wave is a whisper, a shrug, a sideways glance. And to the Polynesian navigator, each carried meaning. But of all the aquatic oddities these seafarers learned to read, it was the shape of waves and the curious phenomenon of refraction, shadows, and echoes of islands that proved both baffling and essential. And yes, there's a ghost canoe in here somewhere. Patience. Let's start with basics. When a wave travels through open water, it moves in long, predictable rhythms, like a sleepy giant breathing in its sleep. But introduce an island, any island, and the wave reacts. It bends, it refracts, it curls around the landmass, like a tired cat circling a warm rock. And then it continues on, but different, altered, marked. And that difference could be felt if you knew how to listen with your bones. Polynesian navigators didn't just ride waves. They mapped them with their bodies, standing, kneeling, lying prone across the canoe's frame, elbows splayed, fingers trailing, spines humming like old rigging in the wind. A wave from the east might lift the canoe just slightly higher than one from the north. A seasoned wayfinder could feel the change and say, "There is land somewhere beyond that swell." Imagine it, lying there in the dark, your cheek against the wood, your senses tuned to every creak and tilt. No instruments, just rhythm, memory, instinct. You'd feel a long swell from one side, steady and rolling. Then there, a faint chop from the opposite side, subtle, unexpected, a contradiction in the sea. That, friends, was a refraction, shadow, a wave bouncing back from an island still beyond the horizon. The sea was trying to warn you. Something solid this way lies. Historians still argue about how well this could really work. Skeptics scoff. Surely no one can feel wave echoes. And yet, modern experiments, including traditional voyages made by Hawaiian navigators like Nainoa Thompson, have shown it's possible. Difficult, yes, but not impossible. Especially when your training begins in the cradle and continues through every awkward adolescence, where your friends are out throwing coconuts and you're memorizing the angle of a swell. One curious term that often slips into oral tradition is ghost waves. These were gentle ripples, sometimes invisible, that crossed the main swell at odd angles, not wind-made, not current-driven, just there, like the memory of a wave that passed by hours ago, or the tail of a wave that split itself around an unseen reef, then came sneaking back from both sides like it forgot something. And then there was the ghost canoe. No one agrees on where the story began. But almost every island chain has a version. A canoe, visible only at dusk, paddling steadily across an otherwise empty sea. No crew, no sail, just movement. Sometimes it glowed, sometimes it sang. Often it moved against the waves an impossibility. The tale varies. Some say it appears when land is near, guiding lost sailors towards safety. Others claim it's a warning, a bad omen, the echo of a voyage that never returned. One version, my personal favorite, says, "The ghost canoe is the sea itself, testing your confidence. If you follow it blindly, it leads you nowhere. But if you match its rhythm, if you read the waves it stirs behind, then you'll see what it saw. The island, the reef, the shelter waiting just beyond sight. Now, let's talk about interference patterns. These are the cross-hatchings of wave systems colliding from different directions. Imagine two conversations happening at once, and somehow understanding both. Navigators could detect these patterns and identify their origin points. Swells from the northeast, that's the main current. Chop from the west, the reef near the island. You're hoping is still where the ancestors left it. One old wayfinder described it as listening with your hips, which, I'll admit, is not a phrase that invites immediate trust. But he meant it sincerely. The canoe tilts, the body shifts. Over hours, those movements become a language, and the navigator becomes a needle in the world's largest phonograph, tracing the grooves of the ocean's story. And the stories are generous if you're patient. A wave bent slightly too far left, an island about 30 miles east, a rise that comes quicker than expected. You're on the edge of a current shift, a sudden stillness, eerie and long. Land is close enough to hush the sea. Even the canoe starts to change, creaking differently, gliding with less bounce, like a dog that smells dinner around the bend. Apprentices often struggled with this part. It's not intuitive, you can't see it. You just have to know it. Many a young sailor claimed to feel something, only to point confidently in a direction and strike absolutely nothing but open sea and a rather unimpressed jellyfish. To help them learn, elders sometimes led training voyages that purposefully avoided islands, forcing the crew to detect them through wave patterns alone. No birds, no clouds, no stars. Just swell, foam, creek, patience, and the occasional goat trying to lick the sea. There's a traditional teaching tool called the papakuhihewa, or chart of the mind, where navigators would close their eyes and picture the ocean's movements around them, like living inside a giant watery compass. In it, each wave has a name, each direction a pulse. They'd practice this chart while sitting on dry land, reciting wave directions aloud until they could feel them in memory. A landlocked ocean, built from thought. You may be thinking, that's absurd, and you'd be right, but it worked. And when the sea was blank, when the clouds misled, and the birds just weren't in the mood, these wave patterns, this ghostly choreography, often led the canoe true. So next time you sit on a quiet shore and feel the rise and fall beneath your toes, listen closely. There may be an island whispering in the distance, or maybe it's just the ghost canoe again, paddling by with its usual smugness. By now, you've surely realized that Polynesian navigation required a certain degree of what scholars might call focused madness, but nowhere was that more evident than in the navigator himself, the wayfinder, a figure of quiet authority, drifting between the worlds of science, spirit, and a deeply uncomfortable amount of sleep deprivation. You see, the navigator did not sleep, or rather, he slept like a navigator rarely, shallowly, and always with one eye half open like a lizard that suspects someone's moved the stars around just to be difficult. In a crew of 20, he was the one who rose before dawn, squinted at the waves like they'd personally offended him, and murmured small corrections. No one understood, but everyone obeyed. He didn't steer the canoe by brute force, no dramatic shouting, no theatrical arm waving. The wayfinder adjusted the balance. He sat in one place and shifted his weight ever so slightly. A lean to the left, and the entire vessel responded. A subtle hip nudge, and the outrigger would glide just a hair tighter into the wind. It was like playing an instrument no one else could hear, one tuned to the ocean's breathing. Now, mind you, he wasn't doing this in isolation. The crew helped paddling, adjusting sail, arguing about whether that last fish had looked judgmental. But the wayfinder was the brain of the voyage, the still point, the one whose internal map was built not from ink or charts, but from years of memorized chants, gut instinct, and a very long apprenticeship that included being yelled at by people who claimed the stars had spoken with clarity, even when they clearly hadn't. Let us pause here for a historical tidbit. The Micronesian island of Satawal, still home to some of the world's last traditional wayfinders, follows an oral tradition known as Etak. In it, instead of imagining the canoe moving across the sea, the navigator imagines the islands moving toward the canoe. Each island is a station, and as the stars shift, the navigator measures his journey by the movement of those imaginary islands. This mental reversal is deeply counterintuitive and yet beautifully effective. It's like navigating a room by watching the furniture drift around you while you stand completely still. And the mind that can hold all that currents, wave patterns, birds, star paths, foam moods, and which cousin borrowed the last coconut rope isn't a mind built overnight. Young wayfinders were trained slowly, first to observe, then to question, then, eventually, to dream, because yes, dreaming was part of it. Elders believed that knowledge seeped deeper if it was welcomed in sleep. And so some trainees were instructed to sleep in the canoe at dock for weeks, soaking up the rhythm of the sea until it entered their bones. But when the voyage began, sleep was off the table. The navigator stayed alert, sometimes for 3 or 4 days at a time, not with stimulants, not with adrenaline, but with presence, that odd, sacred thing. He dozed. Yes, briefly, intermittently, in a trance-like hovering state that was more like rebooting than resting. His ear stayed tuned to the creak of the mast, the pitch of the bow. He could tell if a paddle hit water wrong from 5 paces away. And if you asked whether he was tired, he would simply blink and say, "We are being watched," whether by the stars, the ancestors, or just the crew hoping for a snack break. Historians still argue whether such wakefulness is even biologically sustainable. Modern sailors attempt similar feats and usually fall into muttering nonsense about jellyfish conspiracies by hour 36. But wayfinders had training, ritual, and a deep trust in their surroundings. They didn't fight sleep, they danced with it, slept in slivers, collected rest in minute parcels, like sipping moonlight instead of gulping the sun. And here comes our fringe detail for the night. Many wayfinders claimed they could see the path, even with their eyes closed. Not metaphorically, literally. They'd close their eyes, feel the canoe's motion, and see the swell direction, the starlight shift, the pull of the wind in their inner vision. It wasn't magic. They insisted, just long practice. Though one elderly navigator on Talmaco did admit it felt like talking to the sea in your chest. Now, not all wayfinders were serene sages. Some were cranky, some were theatrical. There's the case of a wayfinder named Kaula, who once threw a fish at his own apprentice for breathing too loudly near the bow. He insisted it disturbed the stars. The apprentice apologized to the stars and to the fish, but whether soft-spoken or dramatic, every wayfinder carried a burden, not just of navigation but of memory. They were expected to recite genealogies, remember who first sailed where, recall which reef took a cousin's outrigger last season, which star fades early in April, which bird lies after midday, which island smells of mint and regret. They were teachers, historians, priests, living charts. And if they failed, people could die, or worse, end up at the wrong wedding feast, on the wrong island, with the wrong kind of yam. That happened once. Caused a feud that lasted 3 generations and one particularly aggressive dance battle. Picture the scene again. Night on the open ocean. The crew dozes and shifts. The canoe creaks gently, Stars whirl above like 1,000 patient eyes, and in the stern, the navigator sits upright, unmoving, breathing in rhythm with the sea. His gaze isn't on the stars tonight. It's fixed on the dark, on the space between sound and silence. He tilts his head, murmurs something no one hears. The canoe shifts. A new current catches the hull. He hasn't slept, but he knows the way. Now, of all the peculiar things ancient navigators did in the pursuit of not dying at sea, licking stones might be the most bewilderingly practical. Yes, you heard me. Licking stones. Not just any stones, mind you, damp ones, flat ones, ones that whispered secrets about islands before you even saw them, assuming your tongue was fluent in mineral, and your pride could take the hit. It sounds absurd. It is absurd, and yet, in the context of Polynesian wayfinding, it makes a soggy sort of sense. Here's the picture. You're 3 weeks out from your last known island. Your provisions are down to questionable taro and that one yam no one trusts. And suddenly, a crew member hauls in a piece of driftwood with a chunk of rock wedged in the vines. The navigator takes it, sniffs it, licks it without blinking, and calmly announces, "Land is 3 days west." The crew does not question this. They've seen worse. One time he talked to a barnacle for an hour and found fresh water 2 days later. So what exactly were they tasting? It turns out, different islands produce different types of volcanic rock, coral, and sediment. These, when worn smooth by tide and tossed into ocean currents, carry microscopic chemical traces. A stone from a limestone atoll tastes different from one chipped off a volcanic ridge. And to someone who's grown up with bare feet and brine in their hair, that difference isn't abstract. It's real, tangy. Even one navigator reportedly distinguished the flavor of his home island's stone by the faint trace of iron and salt trapped in its cracks like rain on an old pan, he said. Another compared the chalky taste of coral to eating the ghost of a clam, which, as you might imagine, was not an endorsement. Historians still argue about whether this was truly reliable. Western academics, upon hearing these accounts, mostly blinked, coughed, and said something like, But modern experiments have shown that yes, experienced navigators could often identify the general region of a stone's origin by taste and texture alone. And they didn't rely on taste alone. The weight, the pattern of erosion, even the smell, yes, rock smell, especially if you've been at sea long enough, could all tell stories. Fringe detail. Some voyaging canoes carried reference stones from home, smooth, beloved pebbles stored in little netted pouches. The navigator might compare a new stone to one of these like a grandmother tasting soup and saying, "Not enough of something, but I don't know what." It was part instinct, part science, part superstition, and all part of the broader picture of wayfinding as embodied knowledge. But licking stones wasn't the only odd habit. Oh no. There was also tasting seawater at regular intervals. Navigators would scoop up a handful, slurp it noisily, and mutter about salinity and cross currents while everyone else pretended they weren't slightly concerned. The salt content, combined with temperature and taste, could suggest whether they were nearing freshwater runoff from a distant island or simply trapped in the Pacific equivalent of a traffic circle. One navigator, famous for his talkative tongue, once claimed he could detect when they were approaching a lagoon by the sweetening of the sea. When asked what it tasted like, he said, like a crab that's recently changed religions, which helped no one, but was written down nonetheless. There's also the matter of flotsam, the odd debris that floats from islands, palm fronds chewed by crabs, seeds half cracked by surf. Even bird droppings with trace minerals could hint at land. And every now and then, someone would fish up a particularly suggestive piece of wood, weathered smooth, notched by insects, clearly fallen from a tree too stubborn to grow in open sea. The navigator would hold it aloft like a sacred text, sniff it, and proclaim 10 more nights. But perhaps the most charming bit of this sensory madness is how unbothered everyone was. No one scoffed, no one teased. When the navigator licked a rock, the crew nodded. When he tasted seawater, they leaned in. When he pressed his ear to the deck and whispered to a knot in the lashings, someone would quietly pass him the taro bowl in case he needed to refuel before his next insight. This is what it meant to trust, not just in the leader, but in the process. The tools might be strange, but they worked. And when you've been adrift for days, even the oddest clue feels like divine revelation, a wet feather clinging to the mast. Land, a sudden drop in bird calls. Land, a dream where your grandmother offers you a coconut with both hands. Definitely land, probably to the north. And let's not forget the ceremonial aspect. Licking a stone wasn't always casual. Sometimes it was part of a ritual, a quiet moment before dawn, when the navigator held the rock like an egg of possibility, touched it to the canoe's prow, and whispered the name of the ancestor who once stood where he now stood. "This is your sea," he'd say. "Tell me where to go." Because the sea wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of messages, of things dropped, broken, sent adrift, a floating library of forgotten hints. And if you were clever enough or strange enough, you could read them or lick them, or both. So the next time you see a stone, don't just kick it. Ask it where it's been. Taste, if you dare. And if it replies with the faint flavor of basalt and home, then you'll understand what the old wayfinders meant when they said, "Every island has a tongue, and every wave carries its voice." If you've never watched the sea glow at night, you might be forgiven for thinking it doesn't. But oh, it does. It sparkles, it flickers, it shivers with light that doesn't belong to the sky. And when you're drifting somewhere between nowhere and maybe there, that glow can feel like the sea's version of a nightlight, or, depending on the crew's mood, a sign you're being watched by fish with a flair for the dramatic. Polynesian navigators didn't just tolerate this bioluminescent shimmer. They used it not as a main guide, no, but as one of those curious background cues that added texture to the great watery map. In truth, it was both practical and poetic, much like the stew they made with 7 ingredients and only ever named 2. Now, to be specific, the glowing sea isn't magic, though. Don't say that to the bard. It's the result of tiny plankton microscopic organisms reacting to movement in the water. When something stirs them, they emit light, not warm light. Mind you, this is cold, brief, almost nervous light. It flashes when disturbed. A wave, an oar, a passing dolphin who has thoughts about your direction. Imagine it's just past midnight. The sky is overcast. The stars have taken a break, and even the birds are snoring. The canoe glides over dark water. You can't see land. You can't see much of anything. But then the wake glows. A trail of green-blue luminescence arcs behind the canoe. The crew murmurs. The navigator leans down, watching the way it flickers differently on the left versus the right. That difference, it matters, because sometimes when the sea glows unevenly, it's a sign that the currents are shifting. A sharper glow on one side might indicate turbulence, or a patch of warmer water moving against the larger flow. It could even be the edge of a current system the navigator's been expecting, a silent confirmation that they're still on course. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional part of traditional wayfinding, or just a happy side effect of excellent eyesight and too much time to notice strange things. Some claim there are chants that reference the glowing tail of the sea serpent, likely a metaphor for bioluminescent wakes. Others think it's coincidence. Personally, I think anything that sparkles when poked is worth listening to, especially if it's trying to tell you not to steer straight into a reef. And then there were the fireflies. Yes, actual fireflies. Not at sea. Of course, they're land dwellers. But Polynesian navigators used them as arrival cues. As you approached low-lying atolls or dense jungle islands, fireflies sometimes flickered along the tree line, faint at first, then brighter, like nature's very own welcoming committee with a penchant for flashing you in Morse code. Some claimed they could smell the island before they saw the fireflies. The scent of damp earth, flowering trees, and bird droppings all wrapped into one. Others said it was the fireflies that proved the island was close, not imagined. A blink of gold among the trees, a gentle arc of light in the corner of your eye, and suddenly hope. But not all glowing things were kind. Sometimes phosphorescence misled. There are tales mostly muttered, always at night, of glowing trails that circled the canoe endlessly. Ghost lights, sea spirits. One legend tells of a sailor who followed such a glow for hours, convinced it was the wake of another canoe. It wasn't. It was an eel, a very large eel. They made stew that night, but no one talked about it afterward. And then there's the tale of the laughing wave. Not its real name, probably, but it's what the innkeeper calls it. One voyage, somewhere west of Samoa, a crew noticed their wake glowing before the canoe touched the water. Just ahead of them, a luminous path would appear, then vanish, then reappear. Giggling, so they swore. The bard insisted it was the ancestors showing the way. The cook suggested fermented yam hallucinations. Either way, they found land the next morning. The wave had, perhaps, laughed them into the right direction. Fringe detail time? On rare occasions, flying fish would leap through bioluminescent water, leaving glittering arcs behind them. These were not just pretty, they could indicate fish-rich waters or shifts in current direction. One clever navigator used the direction of these spark trails to reroute around a storm, arriving 2 days earlier than expected. He later carved a fish into the prow of his canoe and named it Te Rama, which roughly translates to he who listens to flashy fish. Now, these glowing clues weren't relied upon like stars or wave patterns. They were subtle, secondary, but in the great symphony of clues that made up traditional navigation, they were like the triangle in an orchestra, soft, but meaningful when struck at the right moment. Also less scholarly. More delightful children on island beaches would sometimes splash in the water at night just to watch it light up. Laughter and glowing footprints. And occasionally, someone would step on a sea cucumber and bring the whole magic moment to a halt. Still, for the navigator, the glowing sea was one more thread in the net. A sign, a symbol, a reassurance that even in the darkness, something responded, that the water itself, silent, vast, sometimes cruel, was not entirely indifferent. It shimmered, it watched, and if you paid attention, it whispered. So next time you see the ocean glow, don't rush past. Pause, let it dazzle. Pretend, if only for a moment, that you're afloat on a canoe built by memory and guided by stars that blink like old friends, and know that somewhere a sleepy navigator is watching the wake behind him and quietly smiling, because the sea is still speaking. By now, you've met the navigator, the stars, the waves, the birds, and the occasional smug rock. But there is one character in this tale who is not often mentioned in scholarly journals or serious oceanographic reviews, and yet, according to many tired sailors, and at least one sleep-deprived goat, played a crucial role in the voyage, the canoe itself. Now, don't get carried away. We're not talking enchanted ships with eyes and voices. This isn't a bedtime story for children. No, this is subtler, stranger. This is about boats that whisper, canoes that creak in warning, hulls that shift beneath you when your direction feels off. Polynesian navigators often spoke of their canoes as alive, not metaphorically. Properly, they believed the canoe could sense through wood, lashings, even the faint stretch of dried breadfruit fiber, whether the voyage was in harmony or not. If the hull groaned too sharply, if the outrigger shuddered, if the sail flapped at an odd angle despite good wind, it was said the canoe was telling you something. Usually, stop that. This wasn't superstition, or rather, it was, but also deeply practical. A well-built canoe is sensitive. It responds, it sings in the wind, it moans when overloaded. And for a navigator who has spent years with a single vessel, these creaks and shifts are as clear as speech. Just as a shepherd knows each of his sheep by footfall and snort, the wayfinder knew the boat's moods. There's even a story told in more than one archipelago of a canoe that refused to steer west. Time after time, the navigator tried to adjust, but the boat pulled east, subtly but firmly. The crew muttered. The bard composed a verse about rebellious timber, but they followed the pull. 3 days later, they avoided a squall that flattened another canoe along the originally intended route. After that, the canoe was renamed the One That Knows Better, and was given a small necklace of shark teeth to honor its mysterious wisdom. Historians still argue about this sort of thing. Some suggest it's merely the navigator, interpreting natural feedback, wind shifts, hull drag, the distribution of weight, but others, including many contemporary wayfinders, speak of an intuitive relationship, almost like an old friendship. One modern navigator said, "After a week at sea, my canoe tells me what I'm afraid to admit. She groans when I'm proud. She hums when I'm on course. And before you scoff, remember, on a voyage lasting weeks, when everything around you is in motion and uncertainty, a canoe becomes your world. Its every twitch is a data point. Its every creak is a heartbeat. The hull isn't just wood, it's memory. It contains every voyage it's ever made, every reef it's scraped, every song that's been sung into its beams." That brings us to another fringe detail. Listening posts, not towers, but particular places on the canoe, usually near the keel or the outrigger lashings, where the navigator would lie flat and listen, not for conversation, for resonance, a kind of low, vibrating feedback from the sea through the canoe's frame. If the pitch was steady, they were on the right current. If it pulsed irregularly, it meant resistance currents shifting, underwater topography changing. It was essentially sonar made of ribs and patience. More than once, a voyage was saved not by stars or birds, but by a navigator listening with his ribs to the boat's quiet plea. "You're heading toward rocks, my friend." Some even claimed their canoes had dreams, that in certain weather, at certain tides, the boat would tilt or shiver slightly before any observable danger arrived. That in fog, it would glide more confidently if you spoke to it gently. One captain allegedly lulled his canoe through a reef passage by humming the same song sung during its launch ceremony 20 years earlier. It made it through. Whether this was causation, coincidence, or a particularly well-timed tailwind remains forever uncertain. And yes, there were boats with names. Not just poetic ones, though, those were plentiful, but attitudes. The canoe Kelekele Moana was known for disliking southern winds. Te Manu o Leva reportedly rocked too hard when the bard sang off-key. And one infamous canoe, Puali, would not float until the navigator apologized for insulting its outrigger during construction. He did. She floated. You laugh. But if you'd spent a month on one of these vessels eating smoked eel, dodging flying fish, and listening to creaks that sounded increasingly like advice, you'd believe it too. You have to believe. Otherwise, it's just you and wood and water and a creeping suspicion that your entire plan relies on a chicken's sense of direction, which, by the way, once worked, but we'll come to that later. Now, it's worth remembering that these relationships weren't just functional, they were spiritual. The canoe was consecrated, blessed, sometimes named after an ancestor. sometimes built with wood, selected by ritual, carried on shoulders while chants were sung, with no metal allowed to touch its frame during construction. The first voyage was a kind of birth, the last a burial. When a canoe grew old, it wasn't discarded. It was taken apart with care, its pieces reused, its name sometimes passed on, like a title or a memory that needed another life. So picture it, night again, always night. It seems when the sea feels most full of secrets. The stars are back, the foam trails quietly, and the navigator rests one hand on the gunwale. The wood is warm, slightly damp. It thrums not loudly, just enough, like a whisper from deep within the grain. He tilts his head, smiles, adjusts the sail. The canoe has spoken. It is a curious thing to trust your stomach more than your map, especially when you don't have a map and your stomach has recently been fed fermented breadfruit and something the bard insisted was a type of fish. But for ancient Polynesian navigators, gut feeling wasn't just a poetic flourish, it was a navigational tool. And before you dismiss it entirely, remember, when you've spent most of your life aboard a canoe, braving unpredictable winds and seas, your entire body becomes a barometer, a slightly sweaty, sunburned barometer with excellent balance and a general distrust of birds. Let's talk about stomach forecasting. Not the grumbling that warns you someone's hidden the last taro root again. This was the sense felt deep in the core that something had changed. Not seen, not heard, just felt a tilt in the sea's rhythm, a wrongness in the wind, a swell that hits just slightly offbeat, as if the ocean hiccuped. Navigators would sometimes wake from a nap with a start. Eyes unfocused but certain. Turn, they'd mutter. Now, no evidence, no clouds, just that hollow twist behind the navel that said, if you keep going this way, you'll regret it. Historians, in their usual buttoned-up fashion, call this embodied knowledge or sensory integration based on environmental repetition. The rest of us might call it experience, or possibly ancestral intuition, or, if we're feeling dramatic, ocean whisperings. Either way, it worked often enough that no one laughed, not openly, and definitely not until after they found the island. But the stomach wasn't the only strange sense involved. There was also the moon's left ear. Yes, that's what they called it, the left ear of the moon. And no, it's not a typo, or the bard getting into the fermented yam again. It refers to the visual tilt of the crescent moon. In certain phases and positions, the moon leans left or right, depending on the season and hemisphere. Polynesian navigators would observe its orientation and brightness to predict weather patterns and even swell direction. If the left ear glowed brighter than usual, it might indicate a shifting wind or a storm. Front, moving in from the east. If the whole moon looked like it was sulking toward the ocean, it could be time to trim the sail or start whispering apologies to the canoe before anything went sideways. One particular navigator, known for being rather theatrical, would address the moon directly each night. Well, have you turned your head? Don't lie. I see that smug slouch. His crew tolerated this, mostly because he always found land, and also because he once threw a paddle at a cloud and the wind actually changed. Let us pause for a forgotten detail. Sea turtles. Turtles were not pets. They were fellow travelers. Navigators would note their presence in certain regions and use their migration timing as a seasonal marker. If turtles were spotted too early or swimming in odd formations, it meant something was off. Currents were shifting or a storm was coming. Also, some claimed turtles avoided water with bad mana, which was inconvenient, as that was often the very water they were trying to cross. There is a tale quietly shared among elders of a voyage guided entirely by a single turtle. The navigator had lost the stars to cloud cover. The waves had gone silent, and even the goat refused to make eye contact, but the turtle swam beside them for 3 days, never veering, The crew followed. Land appeared. The turtle vanished. The canoe was renamed Te Honu Matau, the turtle that steered. Now, skeptics might say this was chance, or coincidence, or the product of desperation and sunstroke. But then, those skeptics probably haven't tried steering a canoe through open ocean with nothing but intuition, turtle gossip, and a moon that may or may not be, tilting its ear in judgment. And then there were dreams. Navigators sometimes claimed their directions came in sleep. Not just I dreamed of land, but specific cues, a star position, a bird flight path, a new chant they'd never heard before, but somehow knew how to sing. Some believed the ancestors spoke most clearly when the body was still, and the mind had floated just far enough out to sea. One elder described it this way: "When I am awake, I remember what I've learned, but when I sleep, I remember what my grandfather forgot to say." Of course, not every dream was prophetic. Sometimes it was just stew anxiety. But if the navigator awoke and changed course with quiet certainty, the crew followed, because whether it came from stars, waves, or the left ear of the moon, good direction was good direction. One fringe technique, now mostly lost, involved counting heartbeats in calm seas. When stars were hidden and wave patterns were flat, a navigator might lie down and measure time by their pulse, counting to a known rhythm to estimate drift and distance. The body is clock, the sea is cradle, the world is something that can be known without seeing. Picture it now. The navigator curled near the outrigger, eyes closed, breathing slow. The crew is quiet, even the bard subdued. A soft wind hums through the sail. The sea is gentle, too gentle. No clues, no hints, just stillness. And then the navigator speaks. "We have drifted 6 miles west, adjust 10 degrees. No one questions him. No one asks how he knows. They just shift the rudder, realign, trust, because sometimes the truest compass isn't in the sky, or the sea, or even the foam on your fingertips. It's somewhere between your ribs and your dreams, the place where old knowledge hums, soft as the moon's laughter, sure as a boat that creaks, just right when you finally face the way home." Of all the navigational tools the ancient Polynesians used, stars, birds, wave reflections, mood swings, it is perhaps the most beautiful, most deeply human one that gets the least recognition. Song, not chants for the gods, not sea shanties about goats gone overboard, but songs designed as maps, rhythmic, poetic, mnemonic compositions that embedded thousands of miles of ocean knowledge into something that could be hummed beneath your breath while chewing on a piece of smoked octopus. These were called voyaging chants, or sometimes pulaho'okali navigation prayers. But don't let the name fool you. These weren't quiet meditations. They were full, structured, detailed navigational sequences that told you where to go, what to expect, what stars to watch, what currents to feel, and even which direction the reef fish preferred to face when things were going well. You didn't just learn the chant. You became it. A navigator would recite the verses, while at sea, not aloud all the time. No, but softly, under the breath, especially in moments of doubt. Each line represented a leg of the journey, a direction, a shift in wind, a change in bird life, a memory of when your uncle dropped the paddle and blamed it on a ghost crab. Imagine, if you will, lying in the belly of a canoe under a slate-colored sky, no stars, no moon, just the slow slap of water against the hull and the scent of mildew creeping into your bone marrow. The navigator hums. Ohoku rises sharp above the wave's cheek. O Lua sets low in the wind's left sigh. When Taika blinks, the reef is near. That's not poetry. That's a course correction. These chants were specific. They varied by region, lineage, and even by which side of the family had custody of the most stubborn stars. Some were only 30 lines long, meant for short trips between friendly islands. Others spanned hours, entire genealogies of the sea. Navigators would recite them during training voyages, during rest breaks, during ceremonies, and yes, sometimes while pretending to be asleep so they didn't have to deal with a crew argument over whose turn it was to scrub the coconut bowls. And here's the trick. They weren't just songs. They were maps encoded in rhythm. You see, Polynesian languages are built for this sort of thing. Tonal, rhythmic, packed with meaning. A single word could reference wind, star, and season depending on context. And when strung together in chant, these meanings nested like woven mats, layer upon layer of information, disguised as melody. One famous chant from the Society Islands lists the names of 30 stars used in eastward navigation, grouped by how they rise, what constellation they belong to, and what time of year they appear. It ends with the line, "When the sea lies like the back of a sleeping pig, you are home," which is both oddly vivid and biologically unverified. Historians still argue whether these chants were memorized verbatim or adapted in the moment. Most believe both. There were core structures, fixed phrases, sacred star names. But each navigator had freedom to adjust for the specific voyage, like a jazz musician, riffing within the structure of the blues. The navigator could add, repeat, or slow the chant to fit what the sea was actually doing. And then there were teaching chants. These were often more playful, designed for children, apprentices, and overly serious scholars who needed to loosen up. One such chant begins, "The canoe goes east, the wind pouts west, the bird says yes, the foam says guess." That's a real chant. Well, mostly. The bard may have added the last line, but the principle remains oral memory. The navigator's brain was a library without books. The song was the shelf. And through repetition, endless, melodic, muttered repetition, knowledge became second nature. There's even a recorded story of a navigator who lost his voice midway through a voyage due to a badly timed allergic reaction to a rebellious breadfruit. Unable to chant, he tapped the rhythm of the chant on the canoe's edge with his fingers. His apprentice listened, adjusted sail. Read the cues from the taps alone. They made landfall ahead of schedule. The breadfruit was later exiled. Fringe detail. Some wayfinders carried small carved sticks or tokens, not as maps, but as musical reminders, notched to match chant rhythm, a groove for every verse. Touched, not read, like a worry stone that whispered, "Don't forget the star after Hickey and Alia, and steer slightly north when the wind carries smoke." And let's not forget the emotional use of chant. When storms hit, when tempers frayed, when the stew turned suspicious, a chant could refocus the crew, not as a command, but as a grounding, a rhythm, to remember why they sailed in the first place. One navigator once told an interviewer, "If you can sing the way you're halfway there, the sea listens. So must you." There's a tale still passed around the quieter beaches of a lost canoe caught in the doldrums. No wind, no stars, no food save one very tired eel. The crew began to panic. The navigator sat quietly for 3 hours, unmoving. Then he began to chant, softly, repeating the verses for the homeward path. By the 4th repetition, the sea stirred. By the 6th, a breeze returned. Coincidence? Maybe, but the chant, it is still sung, and no one questions why. So next time you hear someone humming into the dark, don't shush them. It might be a lullaby, it might be a memory, or it might be a map unfolding softly, syllable by syllable, teaching the sea how to bring them home. Not everything went smoothly at sea, not even with stars above. Chants in your throat, and the canoe humming like a well-fed cat. Sometimes the pigs refused to board, and when the pigs refused, everyone got nervous. You see, Pigs weren't just cargo, they were passengers of omen. They squealed at ghosts, sensed weather shifts, and had an uncanny knack for urinating on exactly the object most crucial to the voyage. But most importantly, they had an unspoken agreement with the sea. They'd tolerate the voyage, and in return, they'd not be cooked until the feast. If they balked at boarding, well, that was bad. That was sea whisper for something's off. Picture it, a bright morning. The crew is loading taro baskets, water gourds, a mostly willing goat, and the sacred family pigs plump, mildly offended, tied with fronds that no one trusts. All is going well, until one pig just one digs in its hooves and refuses. Won't budge, won't squeal, just stares into the sea like it's seen something only pigs can perceive. Now, a crew may grumble at wind. They may ignore a late rising star, but a pig with cold feet, that stops the whole voyage. There's a case from the Tuamotus of a canoe delayed 3 days because the matriarch pig wouldn't step onto the deck. The navigator rechecked the stars, the clouds, the tide. Everything seemed fine, but the pig knew on the 3rd day, after the tides shifted and the wind came from a more favorable angle, the pig strolled aboard like she'd simply needed time to think. They launched, the sea was smooth. The island was found, the pig was honored with a necklace of sweetgrass, and not eaten until at least 2 ceremonies had passed. Historians still argue whether this behavior had a basis in reality, or if pigs were simply stubborn and excellent at creating maritime anxiety. But among traditional crews, animals were watched closely. Dogs whined before storms. Chickens huddled when currents shifted. Even crabs scuttled unusually before squalls. Fringe detail. Some navigators trained to read fish behavior before departure. If the lagoon fish stayed deep or vanished into reef holes the day of the voyage, it was seen as a poor sign. But if they frolicked, yes, that was the term used near the canoe. It meant fair waters and good catch. There's also a lesser-known tale of the silent duck, a breed of muscovy brought for food. This particular duck never quacked. Ever? It would blink, judge, but never vocalize. One voyage, as the canoe was being pushed into the surf, the duck quacked. Once, loudly, everyone froze. The navigator pulled back. 2 hours later, a sea quake hit just north of their route. The duck was given its own seat. The bard wrote a poem. The duck continued to judge everyone quietly for years. Of course, not all signs were heeded. There's the famous disaster of the 3 pigs and a goat voyage where the animals ran onto the canoe before launch. Crew was thrilled until they realized the animals were fleeing a landquake no one had yet felt. The crew sailed off anyway, ignoring what every creature, including the island's resident chicken, clearly understood. It wasn't a good day to go looking for new islands. They turned back 3 days later, windblown and stewless. The animals never said "I told you so," but they didn't have to. This brings us to the concept of bioindicators. Yes, that's a modern term, but ancient navigators were already doing it, watching not just stars and waves, but life around them. What bloomed late, what hatched early, how the birds nested. When the frogs stopped croaking, these were signs as clear as any compass, if you listened. And when on the voyage, animals continued to speak. A pig growing restless might signal land near a shift in scent, a subtle pitch change in the wind. Chickens would sometimes fluff and perch oddly when approaching reef zones, as if their tiny chicken brains remembered ancestral trauma. Goats, less reliable, tended to bleat at everything, but even they had moments of eerie stillness before landfall. The bard, of course, insisted all this was metaphor. The animals are the voice of doubt, wrapped in fur and feather, he once declared, just before tripping over a turtle. Yet even he quieted when the pigs huffed disapproval. Another curious tradition, giving animals titles, not names. Titles, first watcher, he who knows currents, Lady of the Reef. These were spoken with reverence. If the animal behaved unusually, the crew would consult the navigator, who'd adjust course, restful, or in some cases, just sit quietly and wait. Waiting, after all, was sacred. To wait was not weakness, it was wisdom. The sea taught patience. And when the creatures who rode with you unpaid, unconsulted, acted with fear or caution, you heeded it. One more pigtail for the road. A canoe nearing the Marquesas was caught in a sudden cross current. All signs were wrong. Stars misaligned. The chant verses repeated with no rhythm. The pig, tied at the bow, began to hum. Yes. Not loudly, not musically, but a low, rumbling snort, rhythmic and calm. The crew stared. The navigator watched. He adjusted course to match the pig's mood. An hour later, they cleared the current and found land. The pig was given a sweet potato. She accepted it without fanfare, but everyone knew she had steered them home, so the next time someone tells you pigs can't navigate, feel free to point out that, historically speaking, some of them have been right more often than the average human. And they've done it without charts, without stars, and without ever once needing to be asked twice, unless the stew smelled suspicious. Somewhere in the middle of the sea, between a misplaced constellation and a bird who refused to commit to a direction, an argument was brewing over a coconut. Not just any coconut, a coconut, see, according to one very determined chief. This particular coconut had been tossed overboard to prove a navigational point. According to his cousin, it had been thrown in a fit of rage after someone forgot to soak the taro. What both agreed on, however, was that the coconut had floated precisely, obstinately, and most insultingly correctly in the direction of a nearby island, thus proving the chief's theory and dooming the cousin to a lifetime of mild social humiliation and second servings. This, dear listener, is the story of the coconut that proved a point. It began, as all great tales do, with stubbornness. The canoe had been drifting for 3 days. Riding a swell, the navigator claimed, would lead to a chain of uninhabited islets. The wind was good. The birds were neutral, but the cousin, let's call him Matto, was not convinced. "We are going in circles," he muttered. "Even the goat is bored." The navigator ignored him. Matto grumbled louder. "The waves have looped back. I recognize that cloud. It insulted me yesterday." Still, the navigator said nothing. He was watching the sea foam, measuring the stars, adjusting his chant rhythm to match the wind's sigh. But the chief, who had, at this point, been nodding in agreement with both parties to keep peace, stood and made a declaration. "Let the coconut decide." The crew blinked. The bard took notes. Matto rolled his eyes. And so a coconut was chosen. Not a fancy one. Just a regular, slightly lopsided fellow who'd been sitting under the steering bench looking contemplative for several days. The chief held it up, announced its sacred duty, and after whispering a short verse about guidance and the importance of proving one's cousin wrong, flung it into the sea. It bobbed, it spun, it floated west, slowly, steadily. West, the crew fell silent. Now, historians have debated this story for generations. Some believe it's apocryphal, charming nonsense meant to illustrate a broader truth about natural currents. Others believe it's been exaggerated over time, the way any good coconut tale tends to grow. But many traditional navigators insist it's absolutely possible to read surface drift with something as simple as a floating object. In fact, some voyages did use floater sticks, husks, or yes, coconuts to detect microcurrents, too subtle to feel with the canoe. If the object drifted consistently in a direction over several hours, the current could be mapped and accounted for in navigation. The coconut, in this case, simply made it personal. Fringe detail. Some navigators could detect the speed of a current by watching how long it took a floating object to cross a known segment of the canoe, say, from the front outrigger lashing to the back of the steering bench. One navigator reportedly timed the drift of a pandanus leaf with such precision that he adjusted course by a single hand width and arrived exactly on target 2 days later. The leaf was dried, mounted, and used as a bookmark for the family's navigation chant scroll. But back to our coconut. After several hours of watching it bob resolutely westward, the chief nodded, turned the canoe, and followed it. Matto sulked. The bard began composing what would become the ode to the fruit that knew. By sunset, land was sighted, a low green smear on the horizon. Coconut trees? Of course. They made landfall the next morning, weary but vindicated. The navigator was given a garland. The chief was given the best portion of roasted fish. Matto was given chores. And the coconut? The coconut had long since floated away. Some say it washed ashore on a distant beach and was eaten by a crab with no sense of irony. Others say it drifted forever, a silent ambassador of smugness. But the point had been made, and so the tale passed into tradition. Apprentices still learn it during early voyages, usually when the stars are hidden and the stew tastes faintly of disappointment. When in doubt, the elders say, trust the sea or the coconut, whichever speaks first. Modern readers may scoff. Surely, they say, no serious navigator would trust a fruit. But that's the thing. Navigation isn't just about stars and charts. It's about humility, about recognizing that sometimes the sea tells you what you don't want to hear and does so through very strange messengers. Foam, flocks, the left ear of the moon, and, on rare and pointed occasions, a coconut with places to be. And if nothing else, the story reminds us, knowledge is not always loud. Sometimes it bobs gently on the waves, waiting for someone to notice its quiet insistence. So the next time you doubt your direction, and no stars show themselves, and your crew is grumbling, and the bard is halfway through a melodramatic limerick about being lost forever, look around. You might just find a coconut drifting exactly where you're supposed to go. It's a strange truth of the sea that when all else fails, when the stars hide, the clouds spin in circles, and even the pigs start praying you don't panic. You tell stories. You always tell stories. And that's exactly what Polynesian navigators did when they ran out of clues. They turned to tales, not idle gossip. Mind you, though there was always some of that, no. These were long, slow, salt-etched epics that wrapped wisdom in entertainment and smuggled survival into song. Think of them as flotation devices made of syllables. They told stories of ancient voyages, of islands that moved in the night, of birds that sang in riddles, of crabs that punished arrogance by hiding the wind. They told of mistakes, especially the kind that involved steering by the wrong star and ending up in someone else's backyard feast with no invitation and a suspiciously aggressive parrot. And in the heart of these tales, nestled among exaggeration and laughter, was useful information. How to bail water in rhythm with the wave. How to keep your paddle straight when the wind won't hold still. How to feel the current with your knees. How to tell from the taste of your own sweat if you're dehydrated or just deeply unimpressed with your crewmates. One particularly famous story, retold in nearly every archipelago, usually with added flourishes, involved a navigator who became so confused by the stars that he accused the ocean of moving the island he was looking for. It was right here, he said. I know because I named a goat after it. The goat apparently disagreed. The island was later discovered 20 miles south, and the crew named the new route Goat Path. The name stuck. But these weren't just diversions. They were mental anchors in a world without instruments. Memory mattered. Stories provided frameworks, metaphors. Emotional cues? A tale about an ancestor who followed a star too early and struck a reef wasn't just a bedtime fable. It was a reminder. Wait for the right moment. Listen. Trust your hesitation. And yes, even the bard had a purpose in all this. Every canoe had one. Not officially, but somehow, always. A singer, a joke teller, a voice to break the silence before it cracked the crew in half. The bard didn't steer, didn't navigate, but they kept the voyage human. When the rain wouldn't stop, when the yams went soft, when the silence began to feel like judgment, they'd hum a verse, retell the story of the man who mistook a squid for a ghost, and suddenly the weight lifted. Laughter, like a kind breeze, could realign even the most anxious voyage. Historians, those dry, footnoted souls tend to overlook this. But any seasoned sailor will tell you, morale is not an afterthought. It's ballast. And stories are the soul's way of staying upright. Fringe detail. On particularly tense nights, the navigator might assign roles to constellations, not for scientific precision, but to calm the crew. See that? That's the turtle who waits. When he rises, will eat. That one? The two brothers. They argue, but they always lead home. The stars became characters. Predictable. Familiar. A little absurd. Perhaps, but in the dark, when nothing else made sense. Familiarity was safety. And these tales weren't all ancient. Some were fresh, invented mid-voyage, like the time the goat ate the navigation chant scroll, and was thus considered possessed by knowledge for a full week. Or the tale of the apprentice who accidentally used fish oil instead of sunscreen and attracted every seabird between there and the Cook Islands. These little absurdities bound the crew together. They became lore. Every canoe had its own collection of mishaps and legends. Over time, these stories wove together into regional mythologies shared among islands, passed across generations, occasionally argued about at length over cups of questionable kava. And when they did reach land, when the stars returned, the wind settled, and the island rose out of the horizon like a long-awaited answer. The tales continued. Remember when we thought that cloud was following us? Remember when Chemo sang to the reef because he thought it was a goddess? Remember when we agreed never to let the bard cook again? Stories turned mistakes into lessons, turned fear into folklore, turned a miserable, wet, sleepless night into something worth laughing about years later, under different stars. There's a story of a canoe lost in fog for 3 days. No visibility, no wind, just a damp silence. The navigator, unsure, sat still. The crew began to panic, so he told them a tale, not one of guidance, but one of waiting, of a canoe that floated for 9 days in stillness and then, with no warning, was carried by a whisper of breeze to the exact place they had hoped to find. By the time he finished the story, the fog began to lift. A breeze arrived, and so did the island. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe the sea was listening. So the next time you find yourself lost, not just at sea, but in your own mind, your own fog, try a story. Tell it softly. Tell it with a little laughter. Remind yourself of the time things didn't go right and how you made it anyway. Because the sea forgets, but the stories, they remember. If you've been following closely, which, granted, is easier when you're not being jostled by a goat or forced to share your hammock with a wet paddle, you've probably begun to wonder if the stars are so reliable. Why do they keep moving? Now we come to it, because here's the thing. They don't move. Not really. The earth turns, the seasons shift, and from where you stand or sail, they appear to drift, vanish, reappear in odd places, and occasionally behave like they're just messing with you out of spite. To the untrained eye, it's all quite inconvenient, but to the Polynesian navigator, it was just part of the rhythm. The sky, like the sea, had moods, and those moods needed learning. So yes, the stars did move, and they didn't. Both were true, depending on how long you were willing to stare at them while chewing dried fish, and reconsidering your life choices. Here's how it worked. The stars used for navigation weren't random. They were known, tracked, loved even. Each one had a known rising and setting point along the horizon, like reliable relatives who always showed up late but never missed a party. These points didn't change daily, but they did shift over months. So a star that rose due east in April might rise slightly northeast by June. And then, by August, it might not rise at all. It would vanish, resting in the sky's private quarters, returning only when the season allowed. This was deeply frustrating to apprentices, but Hoku was just there. They'd say, blinking at a suspiciously empty sky. Yes, the navigator would sigh, rubbing his temples, and now she's gone to visit her southern cousins. You'd know this if you'd listened to the chant instead of flirting with the fish baskets. These seasonal movements were well understood if you kept up with the celestial calendar. In fact, some chants included special verses just to warn that a favorite star would soon vanish. When Tiana blinks twice and dives, her path is closed. Steer by her sister's gaze instead. Historians sometimes dismiss this as basic astronomical observation, but they forget how incredibly difficult it is to memorize the shifting positions of hundreds of stars across an open sky without charts, telescopes, or YouTube explainer videos. Polynesian wayfinders did it from memory, and not just their positions, but their angles, their brightness, and their relationships to each other across seasons. Now, here's where it gets trickier. As certain stars became unreliable due to seasonal movement, others rose to take their place. So the navigator had to switch guides, swap one chant for another, one star line for the next. This was called changing the star path, and it was no small decision. It meant shifting the rhythm of the voyage. It meant recalculating drift. It sometimes meant enduring a solid hour of sulking from the apprentice who had just finally memorized the last chant. But wait, there's more. Not only did stars rise and set seasonally, they also rose and set at different angles, depending on your location. This meant that voyages between islands far apart, say, from Tahiti to Hawaii, required multiple overlapping star systems. The navigator would gradually slide from one set of guiding stars to another as the sky changed above and below. You can imagine how well this sat with the one crew member who insisted, that star looks different now. Maybe it's a different star pretending to be our star. He was reassigned to stew duty. But for experienced wayfinders, these changes were not inconveniences. They were confirmations. Shifts in star position verified their movement through latitude. If a certain star began to rise too far to the left of its usual point, it meant they had drifted too far north, or south, or on particularly long voyages, that someone had packed the wrong fermented bananas, and everyone was just a bit off in the head. Now for the fringe detail, some navigators believed that stars had personalities that changed with season. A star that was calm and bright in the dry months might twinkle erratically and grumble in the rainy season. These weren't just metaphors. They were part of the navigator's mental map. The sky had moods, and those moods mattered. One navigator from the Caroline Islands famously refused to sail in a certain direction during a particular month, not because of wind or tide, but because the stars are not in the mood to be followed. His crew waited. The weather turned rough the following day. They waited longer. The sky shifted. The stars apparently became more agreeable. They sailed safely. And yes, we must talk about the uncle. Every voyage has one. The elder who's been to so many islands, he can't quite remember which ones were real and which ones he dreamed. He insists that a certain star used to rise elsewhere, that the moon once followed him. At one time, a constellation winked at him and gave directions. In perfect Polynesian, Historians, of course, struggle with these anecdotes. They like precision, charts, peer review, but the navigator doesn't need a peer. He needs wind, he needs rhythm, and he needs to know that when the stars shift, he doesn't panic. He adapts. The sea doesn't care if your guide star has vanished below the horizon. The sea keeps going. So must you. So the next time you look up at the stars, especially when they seem unfamiliar, don't assume they've moved. Maybe you've moved. Maybe the world has turned. Or maybe, just maybe, the stars have paused to see if you're still paying attention. And if they wink, wink back. As the canoe neared land, real land, not just hopeful clouds and opinionated birds, the sea began to change. It softened, flattened, whispered differently. And for the experienced navigator, this meant only one thing. The final exam was approaching, because coastal waters are tricky, treacherous. Even they tease, they promise shelter, then deliver coral teeth. They welcome with calm waves, then slap with shifting eddies and the occasional sarcastic crab. To reach the island safely, one had to read everything, especially the things others ignored. Enter the sea marks, the reef whispers, and yes, that one angry crab. Let's begin with the color of the water. Sounds simple. Isn't to an apprentice, the ocean is blue. To a navigator, it's a mosaic of blues, greens, browns, silvers, and ominous charcoal swirls. A lighter, turquoise hue might indicate a shallow sandbank. Deep blue, open water, murky green-gray. Fresh water mixing from a river mouth, or the site of a former stew accident, hard to say, without a sniff. The navigator watched these colors as if they were sentences. A patch of water ahead, paler than expected, might mean a reef. A sudden streak of brown sediment stirred by waves might signal the churn of breakers over submerged rocks. They'd crouch at the bow, squinting like librarians decoding a smudged manuscript, and call out instructions based on subtle shifts in tint and texture. Then came the reef noise. Yes, reefs make noise. When waves crash and tumble through coral crevices, they produce a distinct roar, muffled and rhythmic, like someone grinding dried breadfruit through a conch shell. Navigators could judge distance and sometimes direction by the volume and frequency of this sound. One story tells of a navigator who sailed by ear alone for 4 hours through fog, using only reef sound and the smell of sea cabbage to find a safe pass. When asked how he did it, he said simply, "The reef was singing louder than the wind." And then he fell asleep mid-sentence, as was his right. Historians, those noble scribblers, do acknowledge this talent. Modern acoustic studies confirm that reefs generate unique soundscapes that change with tide, wave height, and even fish activity. Ancient navigators, in their wisdom, tuned into this auditory fingerprint. Centuries before anyone thought to drop a microphone into the sea. But let us not forget surface texture. Calm water isn't always safe. In fact, sometimes it's suspiciously calm, too calm. Navigators learned to spot unnatural slicks where water slipped over submerged rocks. A reef just below the surface can create a glassy stillness, unlike open sea or deeper lagoons. It's beautiful and deadly. Now, about that crab, every island has its stories, and many involve crabs, but one in particular, a large, red-shelled beast named Keu, by some has become legend. He's not just a crab, he's a guardian, or perhaps a grump. Depending on who tells it, the tale goes like this. As a canoe approached a long-lost island, the navigator sensed something wrong. The waves were right. The stars had behaved. The chant matched the reef song, but his skin prickled. Then he saw it on a rock jutting just above the swell. A crab, massive. Still, watching, the navigator signaled to halt. The crew hesitated. The bard asked if the crab had delivered a message. The navigator said only, He has his claw raised. They waited. A gust shifted. A rogue wave revealed a hidden reef just ahead. Disaster averted. The crab lowered his claw. The canoe adjusted course. That island, forever after, was called Motu Keu Crab Island. Some say the crab still waits there. Others say he retired inland and grows sweet potatoes now. Either way, the moral remains: listen, even to small things with claws, fringe detail. Some navigators dropped small, weighted bundles of leaves into the water near suspected reef zones and watched how they drifted. If they floated sideways or sank too quickly, it meant turbulent water reef nearby. If they hovered and spun slowly, it was safe. This simple test, repeated over generations, saved countless voyages. There's also the bird pileup. As land approached, more birds gathered, perching, circling, diving. But it wasn't just the number that mattered. It was their formation. If the birds clustered along a specific flight path inland, it often revealed the location of a freshwater source or a safe beach. If they hovered in uneven, choppy loops, it meant high winds and rocks. And if they landed directly on the canoe without asking, well, then they were freeloaders and expected to be fed. And, of course, the scent of the island. Before land was seen, it was smelled, a soft change in the air. Earthy, green, sometimes floral, sometimes damp. It would drift across the sea in waves, faint but insistent. The navigator would sniff once, then again, and say, there are mangroves, or guava trees, young, or, on one unfortunate occasion, someone's burning fish again. The crew would ready the canoe, tie down loose items, prepare for landfall. The bard would begin warming up their landing chant, and the cook would silently hide the stew that had, once again, gone sideways during a celebratory stirring. All of this, the colors, the sounds, the smells, the animals, the wind patterns, the shifting feel of the canoe beneath foot and hand, came together in these final hours, not for glamour, not for show, but because the last mile was the most dangerous. The sea guards her treasures jealously. She requires proof that you've earned arrival. And when the island finally revealed itself, rising like a dark green exhale against the brightening sky, the navigator would close his eyes just for a moment, breathe in the scent, feel the canoe lift slightly, as if proud of its work, landfall. But the journey wasn't over, not yet. First, there would be stories. Now, not every navigator was a prodigy, not every chant remembered in perfect order, not every star path followed with divine precision. There were those, especially among the young, who tried too hard, guessed too boldly, or simply misunderstood the moon's facial expressions. This, of course, brings us to the tale of the apprentice who got everything slightly wrong. Not disastrously wrong, not reef-crashingly, pig-startlingly wrong. Just off, the kind of wrong that accumulates slowly, like barnacles on the truth. His name was Now, or possibly Keela, depending on the island and whether the storyteller's cousin had married someone from the canoe in question. Either way, he was enthusiastic, bright-eyed, full of memorized star chants, and entirely too confident for someone who once tied the wrong end of a sail and accidentally invented the world's first rotating mast. The voyage was meant to be a short one, 4 days, from a well-mapped island chain to a friendly neighbor to the southeast. Now's teacher, a seasoned navigator with the patience of a windless bay, let the boy lead for once. A test, an opportunity, a quiet prayer to the ancestors to intervene gently, if needed. Nao prepared meticulously. He sang the chants twice. He watched the birds. He sniffed the air like a suspicious goat. He even licked a stone he found floating nearby, declared it suspiciously volcanic, and adjusted course accordingly. For the first day, all was well. The crew dozed. The sea was calm. A few fish joined them briefly, then departed, unimpressed, On the second day, things began to wobble. The stars, as it turns out, do not always rise at precisely the same angle every month. Neo forgot to account for seasonal shift and spent a full hour steering toward what he thought was the eye of the canoe, but was, in fact, a minor star, affectionately known by the elders as that one that lies. Then came the wave misreading. Now, excited to demonstrate his mastery of swell refraction, declared confidently that an island lay just over the horizon based on a barely noticeable shift in chop. The crew was skeptical. The goat was mute, but now insisted. What followed was 2 days of drifting in an increasingly crab-infested current. While the bard composed a sarcastic verse titled "The Island That Refused to Exist," historians still argue whether Now's decisions were truly errors or simply premature conclusions. After all, some of his observations were technically accurate, just misapplied. The clouds did look islandish. The bird was flying landward, if by landward one meant toward where fish had been yesterday. Eventually, the teacher took back the rudder. Quietly, no blame, no lecture, just a soft correction of course, and a return to the reliable rhythm of the chant. And the crew, to their credit, did not mutiny. They joked, certainly. Neo became the proud namesake of several new navigational warnings, including Now's drift. When you follow a wave pattern that seems promising but leads nowhere. Keela's pause, the silence that follows a confidently incorrect prediction. Apprentice fog, a condition in which overthinking makes the clouds look like cousins and the foam start whispering in ancestral tones. But here's the thing Now learned, not from a scolding. From the journey, from being gently wrong in a way that didn't end in disaster but in understanding, his star chart grew more flexible. His sense of wave shifted from memorized to felt. And on the return voyage, he said very little, just watched, listened, remembered fringe detail. On that return, Nao noticed a subtle bird pattern, a low, lazy loop made by a single frigate bird against a late afternoon cloud. No one else remarked on it, but Now leaned forward, whispered the old chant, and nodded. 2 hours later, they sighted land, the correct land. He didn't boast, just scratched it into his paddle. Even liars sometimes fly true. This tale is told often, not as a warning, but as a comfort, because every navigator begins as someone who gets things slightly wrong. The sea is patient. So are the elders. What matters is whether you keep learning. The canoe doesn't care about perfection. It cares about listening, about adjusting, about surviving your own certainty long enough to grow curious again. Modern readers might see in Now a symbol of human error, but navigators see something deeper, the moment when knowledge becomes humility, when a star chant becomes more than a performance and turns into dialogue with the wind, the wave, the wandering bird, and the voice in your own head that finally pauses and says, "Wait, so the next time you steer too soon, trust too much, or get mildly betrayed by a smug-looking cloud, remember Now, he got everything slightly wrong and still found his way back. Eventually, with a crab attached to his foot. Yes, but that's another story." And then, finally, there it was. Not a thunderous revelation. Not the dramatic rise of a mountaintop or the flapping of banners on a distant shore. Just a line, a smudge, a soft, dark interruption between sea and sky that gradually, shyly, resolved itself into trees, hills, smoke, home. The island had waited for weeks, perhaps months. It had sat there quietly, utterly indifferent to chants or coconuts, unmoved by pigs and crabs and the left ear of the moon. It hadn't drifted. It hadn't hidden. It simply waited, like a friend who doesn't call, but always leaves the door unlocked. The crew leaned forward, eyes squinting, breath held. One of them wept silently. Suddenly, another patted the outrigger, as if to say good job, without admitting it aloud. The bard whispered something poetic and promptly got a flying fish to the face, which seemed both rude and appropriate. And the navigator did not smile. Not yet. He kept his hand on the lashings, kept his ear tuned to the reef song, which had begun to grow louder, fuller. The swell changed pitch, becoming flatter near the bow and sharper near the stern. The scent of damp earth and sea-wet bark threaded through the breeze. Even the canoe seemed to relax, riding the water with the ease of a dog, finding its old sleeping spot. They were close, but close is not arrival, because landfall, as any navigator will tell you, is the most dangerous part. There are reefs that rise like jagged questions, currents that curl inward, pretending to help, and then hurling your hull sideways like a discarded gourd. Winds that shift at the last moment, like old relatives suddenly remembering a grudge. And worst of all, overconfidence. So they approached slowly. The birds grew noisier. They'd begun circling inland now, spiraling over a particular hill like gossiping aunties. A pig snorted once, then settled down. Even the goat stopped looking anxious and just stared at the horizon with mild judgment. The navigator adjusted the sail by a single knot. One of the crew dipped a paddle just to check drag. Another whispered the chant again, the verse for arrival, the one that speaks of foam flattening, of light softening, of ancestors gathering at the shore. And then, with one final breath, the reef parted, a narrow channel, barely wider than the canoe. Safe passage, familiar, or perhaps only felt familiar because the canoe tilted slightly left as it entered, as if it too remembered this inlet, this taste of home. The beach was empty. Of course it was. No dramatic welcome, no chorus of drums, just trees, leaning toward the shore like they'd been listening all along. The canoe slid forward and came to rest, quietly, not with a bump, but a hush, a sigh. They had arrived, and for a moment, no one moved. Not because they were unsure, but because movement would break the spell of 1,000 miles, sung into existence, the spell of having read the sea like a book, of having asked stars for advice, and received something like an answer. Then the navigator stepped off, not onto sand, onto memory. He knelt, touched the earth, whispered something only the roots heard, perhaps thanks, perhaps apology, perhaps just his name. The rest followed. The goat was carried. The pigs jumped themselves. One fish had survived in the bottom of the canoe and was promptly offered to whatever local deity controlled the weather, an offering delivered with more hope than confidence. There would be a feast, of course. There always was. But first, there would be telling not just of the destination, but the voyage, of the stars that shifted, the clouds that lied, the foam that hesitated, and the coconut that refused to gloat, of the reef that sang the correct song, and the crab who, by all accounts, rolled its eyes and waved them through. The bard would sing too. Eventually, he always did, though he'd need at least a week to stretch and get the fish smell out of his hair. And the navigator, he would rest. Not because he was tired, not exactly, but because the sea had gone quiet inside him. The drumbeat of waves, the inner rhythm of chant and wind and breath, that ceaseless whisper, had finally faded for now, because the ocean had given him silence, which, as it turns out, was always the goal. And now, all is still. The canoe rests on the shore like it always belonged there. The sky has gone soft, no longer bright, no longer black, but a muted canvas of starlight size. In the trees beyond the beach, something chirps, not loudly, just enough to remind the night it's not alone. The fire is low, not for warmth. There's warmth enough in the sand, but for comfort, for the small flicker of story light that hums long after the voice falls quiet. The sea laps gently now, not as teacher, not as test, just as presence. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. The old navigators, the wayfinders, their chants not shouted, but breathed held gently in the wind's sleeve, drifting across the waves like lullabies meant for the ocean's ear alone. You don't need a canoe to follow them. Not really. You just need quiet and time and perhaps, on occasion, a good pig. So rest now. The voyage has ended. For tonight, the stars are where they should be. The waves have gone to sleep. And you're safe. You're warm. You're home. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.